I wish that I could swim and sleep like a shark does. I'd fall to the bottom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Comprehensible Input podcast, where we have interesting conversations with interesting people about interesting topics in English that we can all understand. Today, we're talking about learning and teaching languages, and we have a very special guest, Diane Neubauer. Diane, hello.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me. Before we start talking about learning and teaching languages, can you tell us something about your background?
Sure. Let's see, as listeners will hear in my voice, I am an American. I grew up in the US in an English speaking home, and I learned French and then Mandarin Chinese. So I'm bilingual in Mandarin and in English. I became a Mandarin Chinese language teacher after having lived in China for several years. And after 10 years of teaching Mandarin Chinese, I loved it so much and wanted to understand and investigate more about language teaching and learning and developing language teachers' skills that I got a PhD. And now I work as an assistant professor at the University of Louisville, or it looks like Louisville, but no one says it that way. You can say Louisville if you want, but locals usually say Louisville, Kentucky.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I first came across you on YouTube, where I saw that you were making videos, comprehensible input videos about kind of your life with your chickens. Now, I studied Chinese and I speak a little bit of Chinese. Um, I thought it was absolutely adorable, and it was a huge pleasure for me to understand some spoken Chinese. Um, this is the Comprehensible Input podcast, but can you tell us exactly what comprehensible input is?
Mhm. Yeah, and this is off the top of my head. I didn't go back and reread definitions by researchers, but just my gleaning and understanding from reading and teaching and learning myself. The idea is that you as the learner are seeking out understandable messages in the language you want to learn. And so you may not be able to say exactly word for word exactly what that all means in your own home language, your first language, or another language you know, but you get the message across very clearly for the need of the moment. So, yeah, you should end up with a kind of sense of confident understanding and being able to take whatever action is appropriate to continue listening, to offer a response verbally, to write something down, to make a decision based on what you've read or what you've heard or what you've seen signed, if it's a sign language. That's all comprehensible input. And the idea was popularized by Stephen Krashen in the late 70s, early 80s, particularly.
Yeah, this is where I first came across this idea of comprehensible input. And having read some of Krashen's works, he mentions also something called compelling comprehensible input. What does compelling mean here, and why is it important that the input should be compelling?
Mhm. I actually looked up, Dr. Krashen's work is available free online, at least most of it is, and so he has a statement about that. Compelling, he says, means that the input is so interesting you forget that it is in another language. It means you're in a state of flow, from Csikszentmihalyi in 1990, that idea of flow where you kind of forget yourself, you're just so caught up in the thing. Um, I find that I tend not to forget that something I'm doing is in Chinese, if I'm doing something in Chinese, even though my Chinese is quite good, it's quite advanced proficiency. Um, I don't completely forget that it's in Chinese, but what I forget about is that I'm trying to learn Chinese from doing this. And I'm just enjoying the content. I'm watching the sci-fi TV series. I'm watching one now in Chinese. I forget that, oh, this is a mystery novel that's in Chinese, and oh, I'm doing this so that I can maintain and expand my Chinese learning. It's like that's not the goal is to enjoy and understand the thing there. And I think that's kind of getting at it. So it's difficult to do in a classroom for every learner at the same time. So I think we can, as teachers, we can aim for things that are going to be interesting. We can work with students to find those things. If you are listening to this podcast, though, you are probably seeking out some of that kind of personally just gripping or intriguing or interesting content that makes you want to continue to listen or read simply because you're enjoying the content itself.
So, as a bit of a summary, then we can say that input is like language that we listen to or language that we read. Comprehensible means that it's understandable, that we can follow the idea, and this idea of compelling means that when if we're reading something in English, in Chinese, or something that's not our first language, what we're thinking about is not like, oh, that's an interesting word or that's an interesting grammatical construction, but we're thinking like, what happens to the character? What's going to happen next in the story, right?
Yes, yes. If it's a story, let's say maybe like I've sometimes watched videos of recipes in Chinese because I want to learn some Chinese cooking. So I'm engrossed in the task itself. I'm not thinking about, oh, which character is that? What stroke order would that be? I'm thinking about, okay, how much of the flour do I need to make that flatbread the way that she's doing it? And do I have the right kind of salt for this? Like that. I'm thinking about the meaning and the message. And it's funny because it's the way we usually live our lives, I think. We're usually focused on the meaning and the message of things when we're not in a language learning setting. And somehow, when we think of language learning, we have all these pieces of baggage that like filters and lenses that we think we have to do all these special things. And in fact, humans are wired for using language and developing language abilities. And so, tap into that. That's do human things with language. How's that?
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit generally about learning languages. Firstly, what are some different reasons why a person might decide to learn another language?
So very, very many. I know when I have spoken recently with some adult language learners, sometimes they are interested because of a personal connection to family, to a loved one, to a love interest, maybe because of a work situation that they're needing to develop another language skill, whether it's in their home country or somewhere new. I think also people know that there are cognitive benefits from language learning. And so sometimes older people are seeking to learn languages because they know that that is helpful for their own brain ability and their learning ability and maintaining um, better mental health through their later years. So but I would say, I mean, a great majority of us had language learning thrust upon us either because it was a school requirement or because of a place that we were taken with family or moved where we needed to learn the language to be able to really survive and work in that space.
And do you know if there's any research that shows that one motivation leads to better results than another one? For example, like if you're a child and you're forced to learn it, are you less likely to be successful in that language than someone who's learning it because of a love interest?
I I think it varies in a certain way, but I think the principle is what were the experiences that the person had. And so sometimes we measure language learning by whatever it is that you experienced in a classroom setting or did on your own. All of that, people treat it like it both that it matters and it doesn't matter. It does matter. It does matter. The hours of exposure to language. If your language class is giving you very minimal exposure to comprehensible language that is communicatively used, that is, we're doing something through the language besides learning about language. Um, if you have only a minimum of that in the classroom setting, you're not as likely to develop communicative language ability. And that's, I'm drawing on years of research that look at these kinds of things. Like if you're studying grammar and you're memorizing vocabulary in a classroom setting, that is less likely to lead you towards truly being able to use the language spontaneously without rehearsing in normal life. So that side of things will vary much more than, like, what caused you to start to learn the language. Like, if you are immersed well, I say immersed, if you are consistently getting experience in the language, particularly comprehensibly, you're going to progress. And different people may progress at a faster rate. I think there is such a thing as language aptitude that helps people a little bit, but it's not the whole thing. You don't have to be gifted in a certain way to gain an additional language. You just need time and good exposure to comprehensible input, and maybe a little bit of extra stuff will help you along the way, but those are the big pieces.
It's interesting that you mentioned that older people sometimes try to learn a language to help them with their, brain health or something like this. I've heard music is also good for this. But there seems to be, a lot of people I know have said that, they're over 40 years old and it's too late for them. They can't learn a language and that children are just naturally better suited to learn languages. Is it true that people over the age of 40 can't learn new languages?
No. So the thing that might be different is that children have an advantage in developing an accent that sounds more native-like. So if you are learning a language at age 45, 65, somewhere as an older person, it's possible that it will be harder for you to adapt your mouth and the way that you use your tongue and the muscles in your body to produce sounds. And so you may have an accent, but many times an accent can be very pleasing and interesting to people. And so I tried to think about it that way myself with the languages that I speak, I'm one that likes a very native-like sound to my Mandarin, yet I know that anyone listening long enough is going to know, "Mm, that is not her first language." And so it's okay. It's okay. A non-native user of a language is a user of the language, and it is not a deficient language. It is a different language ability than a monolingual speaker of that language. So if you only know English, for example, sometimes that is seen as prestigious by the non-native learner of English, but I would prefer to just see that these are just different kinds of situations and life experiences that have allowed people to gain English. And if you're gaining English as a second or third or fourth language, um, please recognize the wonderful gift you're giving to yourself by expanding your language ability, and don't be so hard on yourself if you're not able to drop any kind of accent or any kind of influence from the other languages you know. It is okay. The message and communication needs to be the priority. Unfortunately, many times accent or our appearance or our background is judged, particularly by a native speaker of the language, and can be judged harshly. So there is some social kind of credibility to having really fluent and very polished sounding language, that can be an advantage, because of people's biases. But it's not that your language is somehow lesser because of that.
Yeah, I think it's a great advantage of learning English, and I'm sure it's the same with many other languages too. But there's just so much variety of language production in English. Like I'm from the UK, and if I go just 10 miles down the road, somebody will have a slightly different accent. And you are right that people do judge people, but in my experience, like first L1 users of the language or native speakers of the language, we judge other native speakers more harshly for how they
Mm.
speak and their accent than we would someone who's learning English as a second language. I think you're right that it kind of sounds nice when we hear someone with a different accent. It makes it, I don't know about the word exotic, but it's different, it's novel, and it's interesting.
Mhm.
With your Chinese, as I understand, there are many, varieties or dialects in Chinese. Some of them are very different to others. You said that you were hoping to, or that you tried to get a native like sounding. Is there a particular type of Chinese that you want to sound like?
Mhm. That in Mandarin Chinese, there's a very standardized version of Mandarin pronunciation called Putonghua, or Standard Mandarin, I guess, is the English for that. And so there is an advantage to being able to speak in that way. Um, but I also learned the local dialect of the part of China where I lived the longest, so the Kunming dialect, and I love that. I love that. And so it's not entirely the same, but over time people can understand if you came to that part of China from somewhere else. But then there are also just pronunciations and word usage differences even among those claiming Putonghua or that standard
Mhm.
Mandarin. And so in the north of China versus the south of China versus Taiwan versus Singapore and some of other places like Malaysia where um, Mandarin is spoken widely, th- you're going to hear some differences anyway. So, yeah.
Um, so many people might say that it was a very brave thing for you to learn Chinese, since the language is considered to be incredibly difficult. Are some languages like objectively more difficult to learn than others?
The answer that I've heard from a researcher named Bill Van Patten is a resounding no. That what happens is the complexity of a language in some area tends to be evened out in others. Take an example of Mandarin Chinese. There are characters, there are tones, there are a lot of homophones or words that sound very much the same, even exactly the same tone and pronunciation in terms of consonants and vowels. But there is no verb conjugation and there are no verb tenses at all. There are verbs are verbs. And so it's very easy to learn a Chinese verb because it never changes. It takes Spanish. You know, Spanish is more transparent in its writing system, but the grammar is quite complex. And there are many, is it 24? I think I've heard 24 tenses, something like that. There are a lot of ways that the verbs themselves change to reflect the meaning of the word. And so Spanish to me sounds like, oh, objectively, doesn't that sound very challenging? However, the way that we acquire languages is something that people are good at doing. It does take time. It does take exposure and repeated, over time, repeated exposure to words and phrases in context where they make sense. And so being able to understand those messages develops over time. So there is like a progression there, but it is not impossible, regardless of what language it is. It's the exposure, the time, and the kinds of things. The one thing I keep thinking in the back of my mind is that sometimes people hear about the idea of comprehensible input, and so they're thinking of it in a very maybe based on their previous experience in language learning. And so they're thinking, okay, so that means I need to memorize this conversational dialogue because I can understand this. And like, no, no, you're looking for more in context use of language, more variations of use of the same words and phrases. So that you can understand them, but you can see how people actually use them in social settings. So trying to shake that language textbook influence that so many of us have.
Yeah, this you used a very interesting term, which is very common for people who are in this industry, language acquisition. I'll put you on the spot and ask you, what is the difference between language acquisition and language learning?
Oh, okay. Well, there's a bunch of answers that I could say. So the on historically in second language acquisition research, which can also be called second language development, um, they're overlapping concepts, but reconceptualizations of them. And so in early studies, in early science, in trying to understand how do people really add an additional language, there's a neutral term, add. Um, well, maybe it's not neutral because it sounds, never mind that. Don't, but the idea that the acquisition is you're gaining something, you're acquiring it, you're taking it in and building it and making it your own thing in your own mind and brain. And so that idea of acquisition was developing a language system of your own in your mind. So you have a language feel, you have spontaneous ability. It's not based on memorizing phrases and producing them on the spot, or you know it. And so in the moment you need to say something, you can. And when you need to understand what someone says, you can. And you know what to do. If you can't understand, you can go back and forth with them. So you have those skills. That's an acquired system. Stephen Krashen likes to talk about two kinds of aspects of language, and that acquisition system is one, and that learning is an entirely different thing in the way that he defines it. He would call learning things about, I've heard him call it, I've met him in person, and which is very fun. You should look up his videos. He's kind of a card. He has a dry sense of humor. He's very funny
I'm familiar
and
with
drinks a
Stephen
lot of coffee.
Krashen.
Yeah. Um, so in talking about learning, he will say that's kind of language appreciation. Like, "Oh, look at the forms of that language. Oh, wow. Look at the way that these verbs are formed in this kind of setting." And that, like, it's learning about language. It's an However, a lot of people since Krashen kind of conceptualized it in that way, more researchers don't tend to talk about those two categories as much as they kind of have reconfigured the ideas to talk about implicit learning and explicit learning of language. And it's very similar, where the one is more of you just kind of know. You don't have to think about what do you know, or you're not analyzing language. You're just using language, understanding it, producing it when you need to. That's that implicit language knowledge. And then explicit language learning would be things like understanding, oh, when I see a ph in this English word, I don't say p, I say f, because there's a rule here that blah blah blah, and Greek, and so explicit is learning about language. And there are folks then that like to think about, do these things relate to each other at all? Which one lasts? Which one is more helpful to people and their real communication ability? If we try to do all this explicit learning, can we really even get the explicit learning that we want? There's a
Mhm.
researcher called Michael Long that talked about, I'm not going to get the quote quite right, but what you teach is not what they learn, and they might learn things from it that you didn't teach. And so this idea that the mind is this organic system maker. It's making language systems in your mind. It's doing it in ways beyond what we're totally aware of. So whatever explicit learning might do for you, it might just be fun if you like that kind of thing. I don't know if it does really anything for that implicit system, that acquired language system where you can understand and produce language on the spot. Do you just kind of know that you know?
So I'm just trying to find some terms that might be a little bit easier for the average person to understand. Could we say that something like language acquisition is something that perhaps we do without thinking, whereas language learning is very much more of an active thing? So in response to open the window, someone who's acquired the language would realize that they need to open the window. Whereas someone who's learning a language would think, oh, that's the imperative mood, and they've used the window, and this is the definite article because from context we know which window we're talking about. Would that be a
Yeah, that would make sense for that, yeah.
all right, well, let's move on. Obviously, you know a lot about language acquisition, and it's a fascinating subject for me. Both of us are language teachers, so let's talk a little bit about language teaching, and
Mhm.
we'll start in a very basic way. Um, in your opinion or in your experience, what makes someone a good language teacher?
Someone who loves their students. That's it. I mean, or at least likes their students, wants to be around them, understands them, is willing to work with them. And I think of it like being a language parent. Like if you are, uh, parents care about their children, usually good parents do. and they are patient. They are bringing new, interesting things to their child's life. They're giving their child responsibilities and letting them see things. They're finding out what the student likes and knows. And so, a language teacher that can do those things is really ideal. Someone that is good at tailoring their language use to the level of the need of that student. So, if they are a beginner student, they can really simplify the language and yet still use it to do something meaningful with the students. One example that I do sometimes is in teaching Chinese, I'll show photos of a panda and of animals that are kind of panda like and of baby pandas because day-old pandas look very surprising to most people. They are not black and white. They have a long tail. It looks like maybe a deformed kitten. It's so I show these different pictures and I'm asking students very simple things or making simple statements about this is a panda. Is this a panda? And they agree with me. Yes, they know an adult panda. When I start to show them a picture of a raccoon and of a red panda, and then things start to get we can still use this simple language. Is this a panda? And now there's truly a debate in the room where even though it's a very simple phrase that these beginners are understanding well, they have to think at a deep level and come up with an idea like, well, is that a panda though? And then when we get to the baby panda photo, then it really becomes interesting. A few people might have that specialized knowledge of knowing that is truly the way a baby panda looks, but many people don't. And so it's fun to introduce them to like, yes, this is a panda. This is a day one panda. Oh, here is a day 2 panda. This is a day 2, and so again, very simple language, but we're using it to communicate meaningfully. So, the teacher of a beginner has the challenge of really adapting to that beginner need. Someone who's listening to this podcast is obviously not a beginner. Excuse me, they are, going to be still needing some adapted content. So, listening for, um where is it that the learner needs both to expand and what do they know now? And so that I can rely on that. So the more advanced learner, as they're gaining new vocabulary, you can refer back to the English they already know. You've already done that in defining acquisition and learning. And so um, finding someone who can help you to work with that strong core of English you already have, and then to introduce more specific language or more specialized terminology and specialized phrasing and polishing of your English, that is the teacher that you need at a more advanced level.
It comes back to this again, compelling, comprehensible input, this thing about the panda. For those people who see this baby panda and say, no, it's not a baby panda, once you tell them in Chinese that it is a panda, they're not thinking of the language that you're using. They are shocked and surprised by finding out this reveal that wow, it is a panda. And that's what they focused on, not the language. So it's a
Yep.
really good illustration of this because I know many people believe that comprehensible input is okay after like B1, but you can't really do it at lower levels. But I want to move on and ask, well, where does that leave us with grammar then? Because as teachers of language, looking back on my language, like my training of being a language teacher and all of the upskilling that I've done, I spent about 10 years using a methodology called PPP, which is
Oh, yes.
for those of you, for those teachers, it's the language teaching methodology that most people use. We break up the language into different segments, like this bit of vocab or this bit of grammar. And so I spent a long time in my life learning grammar to the point where I felt like I knew almost every rule in the English language. Now, I don't think anybody knows even half, including myself. We can't
And
learn
then the
every
broken
single,
rules. Yeah.
even if we find a system to try to break it down. We get a hint at it. We get fragments, right? As Chomsky said. Um, but where does that leave us with grammar then? Should teachers teach grammar in the classroom, or not? And should it be, as you say, explicit, like in today's class, we're going to learn this grammar point, or should it be more implicit where you're kind of teaching it in secret?
Right. I think there are a few reasons why somebody might want more of that explicit side, and one is, are they going to take an exam that requires them to be able to analyze language? If you are in a system where you need to do that, well, then you do need to probably at least become familiar with the terminology. Your acquired language system, your implicit knowledge of the language is still extremely beneficial because you bring that language sense. You have that kind of feel for it, like, oh, this one's right. Now, okay, what kind of a rule will somebody say that is behind that? Well, that's the explicit part. Um, is it necessary to develop communicative ability in a language? I would say no, it's not, and we can see that from children who are not trained in grammar, but, 8-year-old children are very fluent in their language. They're still developing more, but they are able to communicate in a very wide range of settings. So we know that it's not a requirement or a precursor to be able to gain language ability. I think so that one reason, like, are you subject to a test or exam that requires you to do it? Well, maybe for that reason you want to. Maybe you think it's fun and cool to analyze language. That's okay. That's all right. You can do that. Excuse me. I have allergies, and this time of year in my location, it's all the flowers are blooming, and so the allergies have affected me. So there's those 2 reasons. I think in a classroom setting, what I tend to do is I try not to structure lessons about a grammar point. I try to structure a lesson about something we're going to do with language or learn about language, like some kind of information or content, like pandas, like that example that I gave. Maybe we're going to co-create a story. We're going to be imaginative together and play through the use of the language. So I have some other goal besides learning about language. Learning about language is going to be folded into that constantly. And so you are gaining grammar knowledge if grammar is structure of language. By gaining language ability, you are developing implicit knowledge of the grammar. So it's not that it's not there at all. Now, if do you need to understand that you understand it? Um, maybe for some who like it, maybe for some who are tested on it. I can say I do something that's sort of in between the extremes. Like, I'm not planning based on grammar in the classes I teach, and I am not, like, I do want to make it sound like real native-like use of language. So I want to use natural grammar, as much as I can, even though I'm keeping language simpler to keep it understandable to new learners. But I am also, on occasion, I know that there are points in learning where something might be confusing or something. And here's what I mean. If it were in English, let's say someone was new to encountering a past tense word, something like, she went to the store. I could say, hey, when did this happen? How do you know? Like, that's a little bit of a grammar thing there, like, "Oh, it was in the past because it says went." Okay, well, what if we said, "She goes to the store?" What's different about the meaning now? Well, she's doing it on a regular basis maybe, or she's doing it right now in this photo we're looking at, or something like that. Like, oh, okay, so that, like, you're gaining the meaning out of those pieces of language, and I call those pop-up grammar, and I'm not the only one that calls it that. I forget who started with it, but, um, the idea is, like, in the moment at places where a learner might get confused about the meaning because the form has changed a little bit. Like, we wanna think about, "Oh, that little bit of language means that? Oh, okay." Now we go on, and we keep communicating. So it's this very context-based, in the moment of need, and again over time, so that the learner is tying this form does this thing for the meaning. And by form, I mean this part of the word, this change to the verb, this kind of action in the grammar. But it has something that it does to mean something. And focusing on that again is where I would put the attention. It's easy to miss those. That has been found in research too, that it's learners often will kind of block or overlook some of those aspects of language. So I think it can at times help teachers to kind of point those out. Learners on their own might miss them, and that might be okay too. So I don't
Yeah.
know that it helps a ton. I do find that it might help people interpret the meaning out of words that are easily misunderstood or misinterpreted.
I like this term pop-up question. I've heard a couple of things like CCQs, like comprehension check questions, and also this term guided discovery, that our role as teachers isn't to say like this is the past form, but our role is to guide our students to make those kind of key discoveries for themselves. Um, we're kind of coming close towards the end, but one thing I want to ask you about, many people have told me that, my job as a language teacher has a very limited shelf life. So maybe in 5 or 10 years, there will be no need for people like me to teach languages because we have this thing called artificial intelligence. And a lot of people, including myself, I use it a lot to help me with my language learning. It can be a great tool for that. Do you think AI will completely replace teachers in the future, or do you think it will just be a huge benefit for teachers, or do you think it's just a small trend that is here today but will disappear tomorrow?
Mm. Well, I don't think it's a trend. It's it I think it will change the way in which we use and learn languages, but I don't think it makes it obsolete in the same way that computers have not eliminated our need to learn how to compose writing. Or, it's a tool that helps us. It's a very specialized tool, but we still need the human skills of wisdom to be able to evaluate the results that AI gives us. So at present at least, I think about AI more like a really high-powered calculator would be for math. But this is for taking lots of bits of language and compiling it. It's it's not really intelligent, it's artificial more than it's intelligence. Um, it's very good at parsing massive amounts of what humans have created, and now it can produce more that mimics, but it's not always correct, and it needs to be checked by humans. If you lack expertise in a certain area and you ask AI for information about it, sometimes it will shape its results based on the way you asked, and it might miss some details. It hallucinates is the term I have heard. It will create things that sound very reasonable, but are not really good fact-checked data, and you can even ask, like, "Huh, I haven't heard that before. Are you sure about that?" And the AI model will come back and say, "You're right. I didn't know that." And so, we do need some caution, and always some wisdom, but also, y so that's the tool. It's a very specialized, seemingly high-powered tool, but it's not perfect, and it doesn't replace our own desire for sure, or need for a good, strong mental representation of languages that we are learning.
So there are people who would say that, this is just the first incarnation of AI, and sure, it has that limitation, the hallucinations that you mentioned, and it's very quick to give up as soon as you question it on anything. It's very quick to say you're absolutely right. But of course,
Uh-huh.
there are people who say, well, that's where we are in 2025. But if we think of where we might be in 2050,
Mm,
once we fix some of those problems, perhaps it could replace it. But as language teachers, something that we're panicking about in the UK a little bit is the use of coursework. Now, I don't know if it's the same in China or if it's the same in the USA, but I remember when I was at school, about 40% of our final mark at like the age of 16, we have some important exams, was based on the coursework that we do. Um,
hmm.
while AI does have limitations, it can certainly write coursework that is at that level, and with the teenagers are very good at trial and error and finding out what works. With the correct prompt, it can even produce limited academic persuasion or something to make it look a bit more natural. It's very
Right.
difficult to check, even though as a teacher I feel like I have uh, an instinct when a student has produced language that's been
Yeah.
produced by ChatGPT. Will it change the way that will it change the type of tasks that we give our students?
I hope it does, because I think that's the main answer. As I've been teaching at the university level, I've already been seeing that change, and a lot of my students at present seem unaware of the problems of using AI directly, and so talking directly about it, that this is a tool in this class, you can use it for this and this. You need to report to me that you did at the end, and that's fine if you did to do XYZ part of this assignment, but I don't want you writing it because the whole goal is for you to use the writing experience to learn to think. Because actually, this is another Stephen Krashen idea that writing is thinking. And he's not alone in saying that, but I've heard him say that too, that when we are writing, we're refining and honing our ideas. And so why would we hand that off? Like, let's let's polish the ideas we already have, or let's get unstuck, get some random ideas from AI and then run with one that's going to be one that really resonates with us or something like that. Like, there are reasons we could benefit from using AI in it, but to have it create it on our behalf, that just feels like an art that made us feel artificial. Like the AI gets the real thing if we're just turning everything over to that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting the kind of the feedback loop or the bidirectional relationship, how AI produced text might even then influence the way that we write text. But I think that's
Mhm.
a whole other subject that
Yeah,
possibly I'll
yeah.
go into in the future. If people want to find some of your work, Diane, where can they find it? I know that you have your own podcast and you make, as I
Mhm.
mentioned earlier, these wonderful chicken videos. What could people expect from your content, and where could they find you?
Sure. In terms of online content, for Chinese language learners, I have a channel that is Diane Neubauer Chinese Learning and Teaching, Chinese Teaching and Learning. I should double
I'll
check
put a
my own
link in the
channel.
description.
Yes, yes, yeah. And so I have some that are read along videos. They're helping people learn to read Chinese texts in characters, and the videos with my chickens or other animals I find outside. And those are spontaneous. I just film something that looks like it might be interesting and do a short video clip talking in Mandarin at a kind of beginner level. And then I have a podcast with my friend Dr. Reed Briggs and I. It's called Conversations About Language Teaching, and we talk on it's every other week, about some aspect of Chinese or not Chinese learning necessarily, language learning, language teaching, and our experiences as teachers and as researchers. I do also a few other things. I've worked with ACTFul, the American, well, it used to be, it's the U.S. Language Teacher Association, language professionals in the U.S. I'm a volunteer with them very often on different projects. I've written a book with Chung and Sui, mainly for language teachers, mainly for Chinese language teachers, that is might be of interest to other language teachers as well if they wanted to look that up. That's comprehension-based Chinese. And I think those are the big things that might be viewable online. So, yeah.
Well, it's
Thank you
been
so
really
much for inviting me to come, Glenn. This has been a fun discussion. So, and I wish your podcast the best and your learners.
thank you so much for taking part. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you. I hope our listeners have found it as interesting as I found it.
Very good.
I wish